Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Sam Joseph, and I'm moderating the 10th YouTube session of the 7th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award winning best selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out about the Pixel Project at thepixelproject.net. So today we have a very special guest for our Read for Pixels live discussion and Q&A session, the fabulous science fiction and fantasy author Samantha Shannon. Woo!
Hi,
Samantha
I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Samantha. Samantha is the New York Times and Sunday Times best-selling author of the Bone Season series. Film and TV rights have been acquired by Imaginarium Studios, and her work has been translated into 26 languages. The Priory of the Orange Tree is her fourth novel, and her first outside of the Bone Season series. She lives in London. So Samantha has generously donated 3 awesome goodie bundles to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So she has them with her right now. So I'm going to introduce them and maybe we can just look through how awesome they are. So goodie bundle number 1 is the Bone Season bundle, and it's one UK edition paperback set of the Bone Season trilogy, including the Bone Season, the Mime Order, and the Song Rising, and they will all be signed and personalized. And one set of Bone Season themed temporary tattoos. Goodie bundle number 2 is the Song Rising bundle, and this is a rare hardcover edition. It's one copy of the white hardcover UK edition of the Song Rising with sprayed edges. This edition, whoa, look at that, it's awesome.
It's gorgeous.
This edition is now a rarity and much sought after by book collectors. It also comes with one set of Bone Season themed temporary tattoos. And the final goodie bundle is Samantha Shannon's The Mime Order bundle. It's a first edition red hardcover of the Mime Order. You may choose between the US or UK editions, and one set of Bone Season themed temporary tattoos. So there is only one set of each of these bundles, and they are available for donors in the UK and US only. So if you live in either of these countries and would love to get your mitts on one of these exclusive treats, donate now to snag one before someone else does. We've raised $2,230 towards our $5,000 goal so far, which is so please give generously before the fundraiser ends on the 18th of October 2020. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Samantha questions live. Just make sure that you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen, and Xiaoqun, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me and read out for Samantha to answer. So now I'm going to put Samantha on screen to give her awesome reading. Oh my God, I did the opposite.
Okay, so am I just doing my reading first? Oh, I can't hear you anymore.
Oh no, yes.
Oh, I can hear you. Yes. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to read a section from The Priory of the Orange Tree, which is my most recently published book, published in 2019. The section that I'm going to read is from approximately nearly the middle of this massive book. And it's going to be a little bit from the perspective of Ede, who is a lady in waiting to the Queen of Innis, Sabran. Ascalon was the first and only capital of Innis. Its cobbled streets were home to thousands of people from all corners of Virtudom and beyond. Before Gallian Berethnet had returned to these isles, they had been a patchwork of ever-warring territories, ruled by a surfeit of overlords and princelings. Gallian had united them all under one crown, his crown. The capital he built, named after his sword, was said to have been a paradise once. Now it was as rife with knavery and filth as any other city. Most of its buildings were stone. After the grief of ages, when fire had raged across Innis, a law had been passed to ban thatched roofs. Only a handful of wooden houses, designed by Rosarian II, had been allowed to remain for their beauty. Dark timberwork, arranged in opulent designs, formed a striking contrast to the white of their filling. The richer wards were rich indeed. Queenside boasted 50 goldsmiths and twice as many silversmiths. Hen Street was for workshops, where inventors devised new weapons to defend Innis. On the Isle of Nells, Pounce Lane was for poets and playwrights, Brazen Alley for booksellers. Goods from elsewhere in the world were sold at the Great Market in Werrell Square. Bright lacy and copper and ceramic and gold jewellery, mentish paintings and marquetry and salt-glazed pottery, rare cranberry glass from the old Serene Republic of Carmentum, perfume burners and skystone from the Erseer. In the poorer wards the royal party would visit today, like Kine End and the Setts, life was less beautiful. In these wards were the shambles, the brothels disguised as inns to avoid the order of sanctarians, and alehouses where footpads counted stolen coin. Tens of thousands of Innish people were out in force, waiting for a glimpse of their queen. The sight of them struck disquiet into Ede. There had been no cutthroat since the marriage, but she was certain the threat had not yet diminished. The royal procession stopped outside the sanctuary of Our Lady, which was believed to house the tomb of Cleolind. Ede knew that it did not. It was the highest building in Innis, taller even than the Alabastron Tower, made of a pale stone that shone beneath the sun. Ede stepped from the coach into the light. It had been a long time since she had walked the streets of Ascalon, but she knew them well. Before Cassart had presented her to Queen Sabran, she had spent a month learning every vein and sinew of the city, so she would find her way if she ever had to flee from court. A concourse had gathered at the steps of the sanctuary, hungry for attention from their sovereign. They had scattered queen flower and jewel lilies over the cobblestones. While the maids of honour and the extraordinary chamberers emerged from their coaches with Eliva Marchin, Ede took stock of the crowd. "I don't see Lady Trude," she said to Catrion. "She has a headache." Catrion pursed her lips. "A fine day for it." Margaret came to stand beside them. "I expected a great many people," she said, breath clouding, "but by the saint, I think the whole city has come." She nodded to the royal coach. "Here we go." Ede braced herself. When Llewellyn emerged, the Innish cheered as if the saint himself had returned. Unfazed, he raised a hand in greeting before extending it to Sabran, who climbed out with poise. The roar of the crowd grew so loud, so fast, that it seemed to Ede to transcend sound and attain a physicality. It wrenched out her breath and dealt a blow to her insides. She felt Catrion shiver with exhilaration beside her and saw Margaret stare as the Innish went to their knees before their queen. Hats were removed, tears were shed, and she thought the cheers would lift the sanctuary of Our Lady from the ground. Sabran stood like one stricken by a thunderbolt. Ede watched her take it all in. Since the day she was crowned, she had hidden in her palaces. She had forgotten what she was to her people, the living embodiment of hope, their shield and their salvation. She recovered quickly. Though she did not wave, she smiled and joined hands with Llewellyn. They remained side by side for a time and allowed their subjects to adore them. Captain Lintley walked first, one hand resting on his basket-hilted sword. The knights of the body and some 300 guards posted along the route they would take had been mustered to protect the Queen and the Prince Consort on their tour of the city. As she followed Sabran, Ede watched the crowd, her gaze darting from face to face, hand to hand. No good killer would ignore an opportunity like this. The sanctuary of Our Lady was as magnificent inside as it was on the exterior, with a vaulted ceiling. Tall windows towered, scattering the party with splinters of purple light. The guards waited outside. Sabran and Llewellyn walked towards the tomb. It was a stately block of marble, set into an alcove behind the altar. The damsel was thought to rest incorrupt in a locked vault beneath it. There was no effigy. The royal couple knelt on hassocks in front of it and bowed their heads. After a while, Llewellyn stepped back to allow Sabran to say a prayer in private. The ladies of the bedchamber came to kneel around her. "Blessed damsel," Sabran said to the tomb, "I am Sabran the Ninth. Mine is your crown, mine is your queendom, and every day I long to bring glory to the house of Berethnet. I long to be possessed of your compassion, your courage, and your forbearance." She closed her eyes and her voice became a ghost of a breath. "I confess," she said, "that I am not much like you. I have been impatient and arrogant. For too long I forswore my duty to this realm, refusing to gift unto my people a princess, and instead sought errant means of prolonging my own life." Ede glanced at her. The queen took off her fur-trimmed glove and laid her hand upon the marble. She was praying to an empty tomb. "I ask you this as your loving scion. Let me carry my daughter to term. Let her be hale and spirited. Let me give the people of Virtudom hope. I will do anything for this. I will die to give my daughter life. I will sacrifice all else for her, but let our house not end with me. Her voice was steady, but her face was an ode to fatigue. Eid considered, then reached for her. At first, Sabran stiffened. A moment later, she twined their fingers and held on. No woman should be made to fear that she was not enough. When Sabran rose, so did her ladies. Eid steeled herself. The next part of the journey would be the most dangerous. Sabran and Llewellyn were to meet the unfortunate of Ascalon and give them purses of gold. As they descended the steps of the sanctuary, Sabran stayed close to her companion. The party would go on foot from here. They followed Berethnet Mile through the city, flanked by guards. Halfway down it, they crossed Marion Square, and a tinker called, "Get her with child, or get back to Mentindon." Llewellyn remained impassive, but Sabran clenched her jaw. As the man was dragged away by the guards, she took Llewellyn by the hand. To reach Cynen, they had to pass through the ward of Sylvan by the river, where the streets were shaded by evergreens, and the Carnelian Theatre loomed over the stalls. The noise was thunderous, the air heady with excitement. As Sabran paused to admire a bolt of cloth, something made E glance towards the bakehouse across the street. Crouched on its balcony was a figure with a rag over his nose and mouth. As Eid watched, he raised his arm. A pistol gleamed in the sunlight. And I'm done.
Oh, that was amazing. Thank you for that reading. Our audience really enjoyed it too. We have a comment from Luz42. Ten
thank
would
you.
pay for a prior audiobook read by Samantha.
Thank
Thank you so much
very
for that
much.
comment. Okay, I'm going to move on to our first set of questions. Your books and stories include compelling female characters who are complex, independent-minded, flawed, and very human. For example, Paige, Hildred, and Ashira in the Bone Season series, and Sabran and Eid in The Priory of the Orange Tree. First off, what or who are your inspirations for your female characters?
Oh, goodness. Well, I draw quite a lot of inspiration from history, certainly for the Priory of the Orange Tree. So Sabran was quite strongly modelled on Elizabeth I. They're not identical, obviously, but there's quite a lot of similarities between them. Sabran is a queen who is resolved not to marry, as Elizabeth eventually was. Similarly to Elizabeth, Sabran kind of flirts with the idea of marriage for a long time. Various suitors try for her hand, but she repeatedly turns them down. It's not, I think for Elizabeth, it was kind of because she was afraid of losing her power to her husband, which is not something that Sabran has to worry about. But Sabran has a deep fear of childbirth, which is what is behind her fear, really. So there's Elizabeth I. Various women inspired the figures of Priory. There's just many of them, really. Some of the Elizabeth's Lady in Waiting were inspirations. There's a great female pirate who was an inspiration. So I drew a lot of influence from history for that book. For the Bone Season, the characters just come into my head, really. There's not any particular inspiration behind them. I mean, Paige was born out of, I suppose, my own wanting to explore some of my own heritage. I'm of Irish descent, and I wanted to explore that through a female character who was Irish, and she lives in London. I don't think I drew any particular inspiration from any female characters for them, though. They're very much born out of stuff that's happened to me personally, and just I guess a lot of women, a lot of characters who come into my head just are powerful, complex women. It's something I've always had. So yeah.
So, all genres, including fantasy, have their share of female stereotypes and sexist and misogynist tropes. What's notable about your books and stories is that your female characters are not just unapologetically imperfect, but how their character arcs develop. For example, Paige in the Bone Season works her way up from an enslaved person to something greater. How do you break stereotypes and subvert tropes to create empowered female characters with agency, while they also deal with the world around them, including things like sexism, misogyny, and violence against women and girls?
Well, there are many stereotypes, and the stereotyping is something I find really frustrating. And another thing in fantasy and science fiction in particular is that it's not just stereotypes, but we're held back by this idea of accuracy, like historical accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, for example, I remember when The Witcher came out, there was this video of a man who was critiquing The Witcher because it portrayed women wielding a sword and fighting with a sword. And I remember my response to him went viral because I was just absolutely furious. It made literally no sense. Like, this idea that anything can happen in fantasy. You know, you can have dragons, you can have magic, you can have whatever you like, but you can't have a woman with a sword. That's going too far. So you're kind of struggling against that when you're writing in fantasy. Stereotyping, I mean, for The Priory of the Orange Tree was kind of almost entirely modelled on dismantling a stereotype. It's based on the legend of St. George and the Dragon. And I know it's not that well known outside the UK, so I'll just kind of run through it quickly. It's basically a story about a knight who slays a dragon in order to save a princess, a damsel. And this damsel in distress figure reoccurs throughout history in fairy tales and legends all the time. I mean, there's different versions of the St. George legend crop up in several different countries. And I really wanted to challenge the idea of the damsel in distress and to give women agency. So I read this, an Elizabethan version of the legend of George and the Dragon, and it was one that really distressed me, but it involved a magical orange tree that gives George the power to fight back against the dragon. So I decided that I was going to take that orange tree and I was going to give it to the female characters instead. So that was basically, pretty much the whole book is based on dismantling the damsel in distress stereotype. I hope I don't perpetuate any female stereotypes in the Bone Season series. I like my female characters to be able to do anything. And one of the most important things I have is that I try to create non-misogynistic worlds. I try to have it so that women can be leaders, they can be warriors, and that no one comments on it, basically. I think there's so much fantasy and science fiction out there where women, like, the same patriarchal structures get perpetuated within fantasy novels, which means that women, you know, it's considered remarkable or strange if a woman breaks the feminine stereotype and becomes a warrior. So there's various ways I try to interact and dismantle stereotypes throughout my books.
We'll be asking a question about the Priory later on, but right now our question is about the Bone Season. So Scion London in the Bone Season is a dystopia where having psychic abilities is a death sentence or a sentence of indentured servitude. Why did you choose an enslaved woman as your main character, and one who later on seems to show symptoms of like PTSD from the violence that she's witnessed?
So PTSD was something I really wanted to handle throughout the series, because often in books, I think you get a lot of things happening to characters, and because of the necessity to push the plot on, sometimes there's, I think, this sense that we have to move on quickly from trauma and we have to just kind of blaze on with the plot. I really didn't want to do that, so I really keep track of everything that's happened to Paige throughout the series, and I try to make sure that it really comes out in how she is interacting with the world around her. And I actually wrote an entire novella called The Dawn Chorus recently, which is a small sequel to The Song Rising, and it literally just deals with the Paige trying to process the trauma that she's gone through, because she goes through various forms of trauma throughout the series. And yeah, so it's a lot of the situations I put her in, I'm trying to explore things like the historical relationship between Ireland and England, for example. Paige is an Irish person, and she's going up against a sort of an imperialist machine that is very much entrenched in Victorian Britain. So that's part of the trauma that she's going through. Her heritage is stripped away initially, so she's pulled away from Ireland. She's separated from her grandparents and from her language, and basically everything Irish about her is sort of stripped out of her by her father, and she slowly starts to reconnect with that throughout the series. So she has that taken from her, and then she has her freedom taken away from her when she's sent to this kind of prison city. And then she repeatedly encounters different forms of trauma throughout the series. However, I didn't want her to go through misogyny at the same time. I mean, there's a couple of instances of misogyny in the first book, because at the time, I wrote the first book when I was 19. And at the time, I think I'd bought into the idea that female characters have to suffer for being women in fantasy novels. Like I had that, I'd really ingested that. So there's a couple of moments of misogyny. Like there's a moment where a character is is described using like a gendered insult, and there isn't really a good reason for it. It's just kind of there because at the time I thought that was just what fantasy was. So there's that, but generally speaking, she encounters a lot of forms of violence, both in physical violence and, you know, the violence of having taken something taken from you. But she doesn't encounter violence because she's a woman, and that was really important to me in both the Priory of the Orange Tree and the Bone Season.
Thank you for that answer. Before we move on to the next question, let's take a question from the audience. So this is Misty306. Hi, Misty.
Hi.
Her question is, many authors look to history, science, and folklore as influences for their stories. However, you managed a perfect blend of all of them. How did you pull that off in Priory?
Oh gosh. So Priory, I guess how I managed to blend all of them was because I was pulling from a lot of different sources of inspiration and interest. So like I said, at first it was the legend of George and the Dragon. I've been hearing that legend since I was quite young because I used to go to Christian schools and sort of Christian organizations like guiding, and that the St. George legend is really prevalent in that. So I always wanted to push back against that legend since I was quite young. And then history seemed like a natural point of progression from that, because a lot of the versions of the story I was reading were from quite a long time ago, and I wanted to create a sort of pseudo historical fantasy setting. I was interested in the Elizabethan era and the 17th century in general. There was a lot of really interesting politics at that time. And then there's also, in terms of science, I was also drawing from Renaissance alchemy. And just a lot of different areas of interest. And it is interesting trying to blend all those things together. And I guess it's part of why the book is so long, because it's trying to do a lot of things at the same time. And there's a really big world. How I do it, I'm not sure I have an exact formula. And every time I open a book, I'm still not entirely sure how I do it. I just do somehow. But I do really love blending ideas and also blending genres. Like, both the Bone Season and Priory sort of cross genres in some way. Like the Bone Season is fantasy and dystopia, and then Priory, like you say, is like a bit of history, a bit of science, a bit of fantasy. So I guess it's something that comes relatively naturally to me, and it's a piece of advice I try to give to aspiring writers. Like, don't be afraid to mix things up a bit. Don't feel like you have to write into one box in particular, because we're so obsessed with particular genres. Like, what category is your book? I think we often miss out on the joy of combining those things. So it's just something I enjoy a lot.
Our next question is also about the Priory. So in the Priory of the Orange Tree, the story is a heavily feminist fantasy that revolves around a sisterhood of magical badass protectors of the realm, who hold beliefs that run contrary to the patriarchal male-worshipping nature of what is the so-called Western world. How did the very female-centric mythology come to life for you while you were writing it?
Well, like I said, it started with this particular legend I read, and it's a version of the St. George story from about 1597, and it was unusual in that it included this orange tree. But I was tracing various forms of the legend and how the figure of the princess appears in the legend. And like in some of the earlier versions, like the princess's father dresses her up like a bride before he sends her to the dragon, because he's so upset that he won't get to see his daughter married. So he literally dresses her up as a bride in order to send her to her death. So there's that. The princess sometimes speaks in different versions of the story. So there's one version where she literally says to George, "No, go away. The dragon will kill you." Like, she doesn't want him to fight the dragon for her because she's worried that he's going to get killed. So she does speak. And there's another version of the story, or maybe it's the same one actually, but the princess puts her garter around the dragon's neck, and it sort of subdues it somehow. It probably because of her virginal purity or something. I don't know. The story is very, very obsessed with purity. So I took all of those things and I just wanted to channel that into something. So I chose the version of the story with the orange tree, and I sort of gave the women that tree as their source of power. And there's a moment in the story where Princess Cleolind, who is based on the damsel figure, says, "I shall found a priory of a different sort, and no craven knight will soil its garden." Like, she's very much taking this man who came to her country and tried to essentially colonize it, and she just says, "No, like, we're taking this is we're handling this from now on," and she defeats the dragon. it's interesting because I was trying to also explore, it was interesting, I was trying to explore patriarchy without perpetuating patriarchy, if that makes sense. So I was trying to explore things like toxic masculinity without perpetuating them. So I didn't want it to take place in a patriarchal world, but I also wanted to explore patriarchy. So often I will give the male characters, like the St. George figure, toxically masculine traits that they turn against women, but I don't have it so that the women are being treated that way because they are female. And another thing I tried to do was, for example, in Innis, it's a queendom, it's not a kingdom. And that was interesting too. And the reaction to it has also been quite interesting. I remember seeing a review of Priory once, and the guy said that he felt like there were so many female rulers and that it was like overwhelming almost. And interestingly, there aren't. It's actually mostly male rulers at the beginning of the story. But slowly it becomes more female heavy. And I don't know, I found that really interesting. Like even when the number of female rulers was smaller, a male reader approaching it was like, oh my God, there's just so many women in this, I can't cope with it.
Gosh, poor thing. Next question is, did you receive pushback for this idea of subverting the St. George myth? And were you happy with the way fans responded to it?
I haven't received a ton of pushback. Like I received a couple of on St. George's Day, I normally do a little tweet about, what the St. George legend is actually about, because it's actually deeply, deeply problematic as a legend. It has roots in the Crusades. It's deeply xenophobic. It's racist. It's sexist. And yet every year England celebrates St. George's Day without really understanding the history of this legend and how deeply problematic it is. I mean, different versions of it are sort of different levels of problematic, but the one that I sort of was trying to dismantle in Priory is genuinely awful. Like St. George is presented as doing really awful things. Like there's one moment where he goes to, I think it's Persia, and he commits this massacre of people just because they are worshipping a different god from him. And he's still presented as a hero. And then there's a moment where he basically falls in love with this nun after his original wife dies. And when she refuses to be with him, he basically threatens her with sexual assault. And it's really frightening seeing how the author, this Elizabethan author, keeps presenting him as a hero, even though he's doing these like genuinely vile and awful things. And but yeah, he's still for some reason in this country, a lot of people are like, oh, St. George is a symbol of courage and tolerance and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, actually, in my whole research, I found nothing to merit the idea that St. George should be associated with tolerance. I would actually say the direct opposite of that. To me, he seems religiously, racially intolerant and also very sexist. So I really wanted to smash that up. And I have got like a couple of tweets when I did this really long essay about it that I sometimes link to, and I sometimes get tweets like about, oh, you shouldn't say these things about St. George, but I honestly don't care. And then how my fans have responded to it. Yeah, readers have responded really well, actually. I don't know how many of them actually know the legend of St. George, because like I said, I don't know. There's a couple of countries, quite a few, like maybe 5 or 6 countries that have him as a patron saint. So I guess a few European countries might know about him, but I don't know how well known he is in America, for example. So I'm not totally sure. They certainly wouldn't know probably the version of the story that I'm retelling because it's really obscure. Weirdly, it was like an Elizabethan bestseller, but it's completely disappeared from kind of modern literature studies, which is probably a good thing. But yeah, it's been lovely to see people's reactions to it, and to the queerness and to the presence of women. And yeah, generally I felt like it's got a really positive reaction, and it's always really thrilling to see people saying that they connected to it or they saw themselves in it.
We have another question from Misty306. So Misty wants to know, are you still considering a novella or a short story related to Priory?
Oh, I would love to if I find a moment. There's so many things I want to write. I would definitely like to write, I kind of want to write a novella containing some of the love stories I mentioned throughout it. Like I'd love to look at Nicolaes and Janart when they were younger. I'd like to look at Queen Rosarian and Captain Harlow. There's a bunch of stories within the world I'd like to tell, but right now I can't formally announce it until 2021, but it's actually a full-length novel project that's set in the same world as the Priory of the Orange Tree. I won't say too much because my publisher won't be happy, but it's set in a different time in the world, and I'm very, very excited about it. So that's my next Priory-related project. But I would like to add novellas, but I just need to find a moment alongside writing the Bone Season books and this new Priory project.
We have another Priory question from the audience.
Mm-hmm.
Elisha Longfellow wants to know, how did you come up with the idea of Sidon and Starin being the kind of basis for magic in the Priory?
Oh, this is a great question, and I have a very clear answer for it. So in Renaissance alchemy, there is this concept of, you may have heard it because there's a film named after it. It's called As Above, So Below. And it comes from this ancient tablet. And it was this alchemical concept that was really popular during the Renaissance era. And I decided to take that very simple concept, as above, so below, a sense of a cosmic balance, and to make a magic system out of it. And part of why I wanted to do that was because I wanted to explore both Eastern and Western dragon mythologies. And something I was really fascinated by was the fact that dragons in the West are, they breathe fire, and they have even though we have like good dragons now in media, they have historically been associated with evil, specifically with satanic evil. So characters like Smaug in Tolkien, for example, they're like genuinely evil creatures. And yeah, so that was one side. But then if you look at places like China, Japan, Korea, their dragons are more associated with water and with the sky, and they're not it's quite a broad generalization, but they're often benevolent and lucky rather than being evil. So I was really interested in that sort of division, the almost like binary opposites. So I decided to use the as above, so below concept and apply that to the dragons to explain why these dragons are almost opposites to one another. So the Western dragons are more associated with chaos because there's something they basically born out of this imbalance between the types of magic. So that's pretty much it. It was a combination of wanting to explore the dragon mythologies and also trying to integrate Renaissance alchemy.
We have another Priory question from Sarah Lellis. I really love the final battle in Priory. It is the best battle I have ever read. Oh, wow. How did you make it so dynamic and suspenseful?
Do you know what, Sarah? I'm so glad you've said that, because so many people often when I see reviews of Priory, they say like, I love this book until the final battle because they felt like it was too short. So I'm really glad that it worked for you. I think one thing I tried to do was I tried to keep the focus of the battle relatively small. So each character is going through their own individual fight. So they each have a task they're doing separately, rather than kind of doing a bird's eye view of the whole battle. So that was one thing. I like to kind of raise the personal stakes by giving each character a specific thing that they're doing. In terms of making it dynamic and suspenseful, it's weird because Priory is a book about the journey rather than the destination. I've always said that. It's not really about the final battle. And my editor and I did have a long discussion about this because I was worried. The battle was originally much longer. And I was worried that after getting through, 800 pages, the reader was going to want like a massively long battle. My editor felt differently. She felt like I should cut it down. And eventually I sort of did as she said, because I never want to be the kind of author who doesn't listen to my editor. And it hasn't worked for some readers. Some readers felt like it was not long enough or big enough for their taste. For me, I think it works quite well. It's fundamentally just the end of the journey. It's not the book was very much about the things that bring the characters into that situation, like the fact that they have to, surmount massive differences, cultural, religious, in order to be all standing on that ship at the end. So yeah, I'm really glad it worked for you. And yeah, it was just I suppose, keeping the focus close and personal. And trying to balance that with larger, more dramatic moments like Tane being struck by lightning, which is one of my favorite scenes.
Thanks so much for the questions, audience. I'm going to ask a question about the Bechdel test. So, Samantha, you books definitely pass the Bechdel test with the inclusion of complex relationships between women. Why do you think many science fiction and fantasy authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test?
Well, I guess it is perhaps well, it's patriarchy most likely, because I think that for some authors, and I don't want to say male authors specifically, because I know that there are some female authors who write like this, but there's this sense that women are kind of an add-on rather than the default. Like, for example, if you look at Lord of the Rings, there's like however many men. There aren't really any major female characters. I mean, certainly in the films, they feel a bit more bulked up. But fundamentally, this is a book about a group of guys, right? Whereas if that was made for women, it would be like people would just be outraged by that. Like if all of them were women, every single member of the fellowship was a woman, that would still be remarkable in this day and age. And it is really frustrating. And it's this idea that we can't have too many women, or it must be political, or it must be making a comment. Like you can't just have women telling the story without it being worthy of comment. So yeah, I guess I'm not really sure why people can't pass the Bechdel test. Apart from that, I think it's a remarkably easy test, so it's not like it's massively challenging. But I don't know. I guess it is just the influence of patriarchy and the fact that there's a natural sort of compulsion to fall back on male characters and men in general. I actually use an example from language. So I'm a really passionate etymologist. Like I love looking at the origin and construction of words. And this has an unusual origin in the English language. So in Old English, man was the neutral word for a human being, which is why we still say mankind. And it used to be that and male humans were called werman. And at some point in history, the were was removed. You can still see it in werewolf, but essentially the were part was removed, and man became both the default term for a human being and for the male human being. And I think that even in language, we perpetuate this idea that women are therefore an add-on, because we are now woman. It's literally we are there is something additional to us and separate from the default human being. And I think that is just something that gets perpetuated throughout all of culture. You just get the token woman character, and it's like in Lord of the Rings. I mean, that has token woman characters. Yeah, no, I just think this thing is like what the late Ruth. Sorry, I've actually gone blank for a second there. Ruth. This is very embarrassing. Ruth Ginsburg. She said that, like, someone asked her, like, how many, when will it be enough women in the Supreme Court? And she said, when there are 9. And I think that what she meant by that was that it would not be a massive deal if there were 9 men on the Supreme Court, but it would still be if there were 9 women. So, yeah, it is just this sense that male is still the default.
What can you suggest for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
Well, women don't just talk about men. that's the important one from the Bechdel test. I guess just think of women as being human beings, who have complex desires and needs, and who aren't, to not write them as being perfect. There's this slightly fascinating Twitter called Men Write Women, and just the way that certain men write women is quite fascinating in terms of like this women being looked at through the male gaze, like the idea that women get up and think about their breasts every day, for example. I mean, I know I certainly don't. But so I think that there's this sense that everything is being viewed through the male gaze. You have to just think of women as being human beings who are beyond being sexual objects and beyond presenting them as if to a straight male reader. It even feels silly that you have to sort of explain to people how to write a complex woman, because to me, I'm a woman. It's bizarre to me that someone wouldn't be able to understand like how I am a complex person with different I don't know. It's a really strange thing that we're still even talking about this, really. But yeah, I guess just I don't want to say write women as if they're men. I do think that we had some really interesting. I think Ripley from Alien was originally that role was originally written for a male character. And that's quite interesting because I think at the time, if Ripley had been conceived as a woman, she probably would not have been that character at all. But yeah, so when I approach writing men and women, I don't think of them as being massively different. Like I don't, but I have 2 male and 2 female narrators in The Priory of the Orange Tree, and I didn't sit down and be like, well, how are the men? What is it to write a man? How can I understand men? Like, I mean, I know men. I've spoken to men. I have male friends. I have a father. Like I know they're not. I know that they're not massively different from women. So I didn't sit and write like a checklist of how to write men. But yeah, it's just I guess just think of them as being women. And if you find yourself puzzled by your women, sort of maybe look at your male characters and think, what am I doing differently? What am I feeling differently when I write these characters? Why is there such a fundamental disconnect? And also, like focus on female relationships. Women do talk to each other, and we talked about things other than men. So yeah, just make sure that you're just writing your women just as human beings.
Speaking of writing women, some of your female characters may be perceived by readers as unlikable because they are ambitious or cruel or pragmatic. When writing female characters, do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes to make your female characters more likable or more relatable?
I have felt that pressure in the past. I remember I had this one interview that really fascinated me, and it sent me on a bit of I've always been kind of fascinated by how we represent women in media since then. And he said to me, it was sort of, the Bone season came out around the same time as the Hunger Games. And at the time, everyone was absolutely obsessed with Katniss Everdeen because she was subverting what I might call the more Bella Swan-like character. So Bella Swan is a character who has a lot of traditionally feminine pursuits, like things like, she cooks for her father, she wants to get married, she's quite a fairly stereotypical, like feminine character. And then Katniss came along, and she was almost a direct subversion of that. She is a character who embodies a number of stereotypically masculine traits, but in a woman. So she's stoic, she's like action-packed, she provides for her family, she's the literal hunter-gatherer. And I remember I sat down for an interview in Madrid, and somebody said, the journalist said to me, why did you write a character who was weak, unlike Katniss Everdeen? I know, I was so offended. But I was actually so shocked that I didn't ask him what he meant. And it's always driven me insane since then, because I'm desperate to know what it was about Paige that made him think she wasn't strong. Yeah, because I was like, is it because she has moments where she's emotional or vulnerable? Or is it because, I don't know, because she tries to have sex one night in a moment of total heartbreak? She goes out and tries to have casual sex? Or what is it about Paige that made him say that? And ever since then, I've been kind of fascinated by how we view female characters and how we judge female characters in a way that we don't judge male characters. And also the fact that we compare female characters to one another in a way we don't do with men. So for several years, basically every female character was being compared to Katniss. Like every single character, every single time you read a book with a female character, it was like on the front cover, the next Katniss Everdeen, or a character just like Katniss Everdeen. In fact, the Bone season literally says that on it. There's like a version of the book that says a character as compelling as Katniss Everdeen or something. And it was fascinating because you don't get this with male characters. Like you don't get like a book by an author that happens to have a male character as the protagonist, and it's like he's just like Sherlock Holmes, or he's just like Harry Potter. It just doesn't happen. So we do have this odd approach to women in media, and it's definitely the likability factor. So Katniss herself, I feel like, gets criticized for being unlikable because she is quite emotionally evasive in a way that a lot of female, women are expected to be emotionally available, and Katniss isn't. She's quite a closed off character. She's defensive. And there is that huge pressure to make a woman likable. And to me, likability is not necessarily that interesting. Like, I mean, I like to have characters who are, of course, if you have a protagonist, you want them to be relatively sympathetic in certain situations. But the idea that women have to be likable, it plays into a wider idea again of that like emotional availability of women. Like I can't, there's so many times when a man's walked past me on the street and said, "Oh, smile, darling, it's not too bad." And I'm like, you have no idea what's just happened to me, do you? Like, you really know nothing about me, but I have to smile for you. And it is this thing that women have to be likable and soft and approachable and apologetic and can't be too harsh. So I have worried about this a little in the past. I mean, I should say that it applies to characters in general. So Nicolaes in The Priory often gets called unlikable. He's like a very angry, heartbroken older man, and he does a lot of morally grey things, and he wasn't designed to be overly likable. So it does apply to both genders, but I feel like women are infinitely more punished for it. And I feel like it's still this expectation that they have to be sympathetic rather than exploring. Again, it's about painting women as human beings. We're not just heroic or sympathetic. We can be ambitious and cold and villainous, and we should be able to write women in any way. And even if they're not likable, for me, it's more about making the character interesting and compelling. Like, that's why I read fiction. I don't read it to necessarily like the character. I have to want to follow the character, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's because I agree with the character or because I want the character to be my best friend. It's just because I find them interesting. So yeah, it is a frustrating thing, and I think it's changing. I think people are more interested now in morally grey women, but it's been quite a slow process.
That's true. We're going to take a few audience questions before we move on to our main questions. So we have a question from Julia. I think you'll probably appreciate an etymology related question. So I would love to know how you created the name Hildesterron for the sword Ascalon. I'm sorry if I completely rubbished the pronunciations.
Oh no, it's fine. So Hildesterron is it's a mixture of the word hild, which is the Old English word for war, and then steron is kind of from I can't remember if it might be that I drew from the Latinate word for that, because it's similar to the word steron, which is obviously it's similar to the word star. It's etymologically related to that. So the word literally means war star. But yeah, that's how I created it. I wanted it to be a reference to Old English.
Cool. Laura Boyle wants to know if you have any tips on world building or developing such complex stories.
Oh gosh, world building, that's a really difficult question because there's so many aspects to it. I think definitely one thing that you should do is research is important, but you've got to start somewhere. So I do a lot of research for my books, like historical research particularly, but I think at some point you just have to jump into the story. Like, so for example, I do enough research to create a skeletal world, and I know all of the important things, like the sort of broader overarching things, like what the government is like, and I basically have enough of a world that I can put a character into it. But at some point you just have to go ahead and allow the character to become the engine of your world building. So for example, if you put a character on a street, you can start thinking, okay, what's the character going to be seeing on this street? Is she going to be seeing, I don't know, food being sold? In which case, what kind of food are they eating? If they're eating that kind of food, what's the agricultural system like? If they might see people traveling on the street, in which case you think, okay, what's the technology level going to be like? Are these people traveling in like a horse and wagon, or are they traveling in a car or something else? So yeah, after a while, the character becomes the engine of your world building. Another thing I do, really important, is asking myself questions. So I constantly ask myself questions when I'm building a world. And it's not necessarily that I have to answer those questions on the page, but it's that I just like to know them for myself. So let's say that you create a country that is largely desert. How are they going to get water? How are they getting, fresh, drinkable water? Have they got a system to remove the salinity of the water? Have they got a way to clean the water? Are they getting it from the sea and purifying it? Are they drawing it from rivers or groundwater? So there's loads of questions you can ask yourself, like how does this country's economic system work? Tons and tons of questions. And so that's what I do throughout the process. I'm asking myself questions. I think that's a really important part of world building.
Right. Thank you for all the questions, audience. I'm going to move on to a question about men and masculinity. Do you think that the violent and domineering alpha male type of character will eventually phase out of science fiction and fantasy, or do you think it's one of those stereotypes that are going to stick around for much longer than expected?
Well, they're very popular. So my instinct is that they're not going anywhere that quickly. So it is difficult because for me personally, I don't like the alpha male character. I don't find it attractive. I don't find it interesting. It's not something that appeals to me at all. And it's not the kind of thing I like to write. Like, I'm much more interested in writing sort of more gentle, compassionate, sensitive men. However, I'm aware that some women do like the alpha male character. And I don't want to disrespect them by saying that, it's totally wrong. Because I think there are contexts in which you can write characters who are like that, who you can do it in a way that isn't harmful. But there are lots of examples of fiction where it is harmful is the problem, and the line between that seems to be quite blurred. Mm-hmm. Like, I have read books before when I'm like, wow, people find this guy attractive. He seems really like problematic and not attractive at all to me. He seems like kind of disturbing, in fact, but people really like it. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey is a good example. I thought Christian Grey was terrifying, but a lot of people obviously found him very sexy. So it's difficult to sometimes remove my own personal taste from my sense of like what is actually harmful. But I really hope that we do start allowing the idea that you don't have to be that stereotype to be interesting, or to be, if it's a love interest, to be sexy, or to be romantic. It's because a lot of the time that stereotype is not romantic, and it falls back on a lot of patriarchal ideas of what is romantic, like jealousy, for example. Often these characters are very jealous, and that is an older idea of this idea that possessiveness is sexy. Like, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I read Twilight, and I look back on some of my diaries from that era, and it was actually really distressing. Like, I found that I'd written all these things about how I wanted a boyfriend who was going to protect me, and who was going to, I literally used the word possessive. I was a young teenager, and I thought that it was sexy for a man to want to keep you for himself. And it is really distressing to see that. So I hope that we become more aware of that, and we become more amenable to the idea that gentleness and openness and supporting a woman can be sexy. It doesn't have to be jealous and possessive and domineering like that, and falling back on old stereotypes of men dominating women. It is a difficult line to draw, because there's differences between tastes and that kind of thing. But I really hope that at some point we phase out the harmful aspects of that character, and that we start looking elsewhere.
Stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change. So let's talk about writing stories and genre. So the line between consent and coercion isn't always clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, or paranormal romance. Certainly in some subgenres of fantasy, such as grimdark, epic fantasy, violence against women is still often used as a catalyst for a male character's development, or as a shorthand for showing how brutal the world is. Do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
I think we're starting to move towards it. This sort of thing is something I find really, really frustrating, and I talk about it as often as I can, because I think there is sometimes this idea, and it sort of plays back into what I was saying about the need for historical accuracy in fantasy. It's this idea that we have to have these brutal, grim, dark worlds, and the way that we show that the world is grim and dark is by having women raped or assaulted or beaten. And it's sort of part of, I guess it's partly the expectation that, I guess part of that comes from perhaps the author's expectation that the reader is male, because for me as a female reader, I've been very fortunate in that I have not personally experienced sexual violence, but I still find it extremely distressing when I read it. So the idea that I could read it and consider it just showing how brutal the world is, we already know as women that the world is misogynistic, right? We don't need to be consistently reminded of it in fiction. And another thing is that often it's under the guise of, well, in the medieval era, women were treated like this. First of all, you're writing a fantasy, you're not writing a medieval piece of history. Second of all, it seems to be based on this totally false idea of the medieval era. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that things were easy for women in the medieval era, because they weren't. I'm not suggesting that women were legally equal to men in the medieval era. But the problem is that a lot of gatekeepers of science fiction and fantasy seem to have developed this idea of what the medieval era looked like that is totally inaccurate. And it's not just about women, it's also the idea that they seem to think that in medieval Europe, everybody was white and straight, and that women were consistently oppressed. Actually, if you look at medieval history at all, you'll find that's really not true. For example, one of the major wars of the medieval era was certainly in England, was called the Anarchy. And the Anarchy was between the Empress Matilda, who was she had the legal right to claim the throne, because her father had given her that right and he'd made the Lord swear to her. And she had to fight her cousin who took the throne from her. Now, there was an element of sexism in that being that her cousin was considered a better ruler because he was a man. However, it's not like all of the lords at the time were fighting for him. A lot of them fought for Matilda. So it's not that there were powerful women doing incredible things and having support for that in the medieval era. And it frustrates me no end that people suggest that we keep needing to perpetuate this wrong idea of the medieval era in fantasy. And it is, unfortunately, it's a mixture of fantasy drawing so heavily from that false idea of history. I think it's also... I have quite complicated feelings about the influence of Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones is such a massively successful piece of fiction, and because it is set in a world that is very sexist and violent towards women. I think that has kind of trickled down through the whole genre, and that a lot of authors do it almost unconsciously without thinking. Like, they fall back on the Game of Thrones system and they'll mention women being raped, or they'll have women insulted for being women, or they'll use gendered insults. And I'm not suggesting that it's all based on Game of Thrones, but I think that when something is massively successful and as much of a cultural moment as that was, it does help shape other fiction that gets produced years later. So yeah, I have a lot of complicated feelings around that. And the fact is, we need, I think, I'm not saying that there's not a place for fiction that explores sexism. I especially when women do it, I normally assume that they're exploring something and they have the right to do that. There's always going to be a place for fiction that explores oppression in a fantasy setting. It's a way to mirror things that are happening in the real world. But it should not be considered the default to do that. It should not be considered the only accurate or realistic way to write fantasy. And I don't know, I just feel at the moment that grimdark is considered more serious, and like if you have a woman being sexually assaulted, or you're dealing with something like that in your fiction, or the world is sexist, I feel that it is taken more seriously still as fantasy. Whereas fantasy without sexism, I still feel like it's taken as, I don't know, like lighter somehow, and therefore less kind of impactful. I'm not really sure. I have a lot of very complicated feelings around this.
What would you suggest to science fiction and fantasy authors who wish to include violence against women in their books?
Well, it's very much up to the individual. I would probably suggest, if you're not sure of why you're doing it, then maybe interrogate that. So if you go into a book and you're like, I want to do this certain thing by including it, I think it's fine if you go into it with a purpose. So, for example, there's moments where I think about patriarchy in the Priory of the Orange Tree, and I present toxic masculinity because I'm trying to deconstruct a patriarchal legend. So I know my reasons for doing it. Whereas I think my worry is that some authors go into it and they just automatically write a sexist world because they think that we have to do that in fantasy, and that's the way we write fantasy. So I would just say, before you do it, just ask yourself why you're doing it. Does this world need to be sexist? Is it adding anything to the world to be sexist? Are you doing it as a way to create conflict when you could create conflict in another way? So, for example, in Priory, I look at religious tension as a form of conflict rather than the characters having to overcome sexism. So yeah, I would just say, ask yourself why. Like, just sit with yourself for a little while and just think, why am I choosing to make this world sexist? And I think this is actually a question that we should ask authors instead of asking them why they didn't make the world sexist. So at the moment, I get asked so many times, why did you choose to make The Priory of the Orange Tree a feminist book? Why didn't you make it sexist? But it would be so much more interesting if we asked authors, why did you make this book sexist? Because it makes it Otherwise, we're normalizing the idea that books have to be sexist and making it unusual when they're not sexist. And I think it should be the other way around. And again, I'm not saying that we have to confront authors by saying, like, how dare you make this world sexist, but just genuinely asking, what was the thought process behind this? What were you trying to demonstrate, if anything? So yeah, I would like us to just flip this sense of what is the more normal thing.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about violence against women while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Oh, it's a difficult one. I think whenever you go into a book to try to show something, there's always that risk that the message is going to come across as preachy. So when I go into my books, I never think to myself exactly what is the message I'm trying to give. It's more, what are the discussions I'd like to start, or what are some ideas I would like to explore, rather than having like an absolute message I'm trying to send. But because both of my books are, The Bone Season is set in a dystopia, and The Priory of the Orange Tree is set in a kind of more female-driven world, people normally assume that I am trying to say something in particular, and they will be asking me, was this supposed to be a comment on this thing or that thing, or is The Bone Season trying to represent a certain type of oppression, or is The Priory of the Orange Tree trying to critique this or that? Generally speaking, I think it's important you can certainly talk about things that you were doing with the books and issues that you were trying to raise, but I think that you almost need to let the reader come to it from their own perspective, because every reader who reads your book is reading a different version of it that is shaped by their individual life experiences. So I've had messages to say, I read The Bone Season this way and it meant a lot to me personally because of that. And I'm not going to change that by saying, oh, that's not what I meant, or that's not the message I was trying to send, for example. Even if that were the case, I wouldn't say that, because you just have to let people bring their own thoughts and ideas to it. You don't want to be too prescriptive. But yeah, you can certainly explore things, and hopefully readers will take your meaning. But I think it's more important to bring them up in a way that makes them think about it for themselves. And it's about asking questions. Like, if a reader reads this, what are they going to ask themselves? Are they going to think about how they consider this thing and interrogate that?
The next question is about geek culture and fandoms.
Mm-hmm.
So geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male-dominated, despite a rising number of prominent and well-known female authors. Plus, there is still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks in the fandoms towards females. So, what do you think needs to be done to make geek culture and fandom as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls?
Very difficult question and a very complex one. I myself am a big gamer, but I've never felt comfortable talking about it, because it just does seem to be a very misogynistic environment, in terms of people saying, oh, you can't be a real gamer, oh, women don't actually play that many games, they just play phone games or whatever. There's this idea that women are not real gamers somehow. So even though I've played games since I was a kid, literally I used to watch my dad playing Tomb Raider and Quake and Doom, and that started off a lifelong love of video games for me. I've never ever felt confident talking about it because of that, because of the sheer level of hostility. And you see this in things like Assassin's Creed. They keep, it's often a male character, and when you introduce a female character, like the Assassin's Creed Valhalla is coming out quite soon, and you can play as a female version of the character, and I think you could also do that in Odyssey. But immediately you'll get people going, oh, this is inaccurate, you can't have a woman in it, you're just pandering. So there is this really hostile kind of this hostile culture around gaming. So that's something that I've felt on a personal level. It's just something I don't really talk about. And I feel like I should, and I'm really admiring women who do speak out in gaming. In terms of my own area of fiction, strangely, even though I'm generally too scared to speak out with gaming, I was very much determined with my books that I was going to write under my own name. And when I first went to Bloomsbury, I said to them, should I be using a pseudonym? Should I be using an androgynous or a male pseudonym? Are people more likely to read my books? And I was actually thinking of J.K. Rowling at the time, because she was with Bloomsbury and had used a pseudonym. So I said, should I be doing that? And they said, well, no, we think that you'll be fine. You should just write under your own name. And I said, sure, okay, I'll do that. I wasn't really that bothered either way. And I'm really, really glad I did, because I feel like there has to be room to talk about, you know, to have women using like feminine coded names, and to not be ashamed of our presence in the fandom. You know, we have to show that we are out there writing these books, and that we are, that we're here, and we are writing like award-winning books or best-selling books. And it has been difficult. Like sometimes you get men who literally come up to you in a signing queue and will say something like, they will literally just say something like, I don't read books by women, sorry. And you're like, what? Why would you not read books by women? And I have a male relative who said this to me once, and I said to him, like, why would you not read books by women? Because women write all kinds of books. And he was just like, I don't know, I just guess I wouldn't relate to it. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, we're not, like, again, it's this idea that women are these bizarre aliens that you can't possibly like interact with on a human level or connect to on a human level. It's just this really, I'm fascinated to know where they get this idea from, that, you know, it's like that old book, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. It's not true. It's you know, we're all from the same planet. So yeah, there has been moments, and there have been moments when I've asked myself if I would be a better, you know, if I would sell better if I'd used a male pseudonym, or, you know, I don't know, maybe that there might be reviews I've got where they didn't like the fact that I was a woman. I've certainly seen reviews that say stuff like I'm pandering to women or to queer people and all this kind of thing, which is frustrating. But ultimately, I'm really glad I used my own name. And I think basically to solve this, we just have to keep showing that we are here and we're not going anywhere.
That's taken us to our final two questions. You have been so very supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. First question, why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
Well, why would you not support a cause like that, for one thing? I think, I mean, there's so many reasons, but I mean, at this particular moment in time, I think the urgency and severity of the situation has shown up a lot during lockdown, because we now have situations where women are literally trapped in domestic violence situations, for example, and they, because of lockdown, they can't escape from it. And I think I read a statistic like the number of calls about domestic violence have gone up massively during this period. So it's really shown up this terrible issue at the core of our society. And I mean, for me personally, I'm horrified by both the layers of violence against women in our society, just the many forms that it can take, and also like people's response to it. I mean, for example, in my own country, I was really shocked to discover that marital rape was not sort of officially confronted as being illegal until the year I was born. That's 1991. There was a landmark case called R versus R, during which a man tried to use the marital rape exemption in order to get out of being convicted of attempted rape. And I was utterly horrified by that. That not only was the year I was born was the year that was confronted, and I don't think it was officially explicitly said in law until around 2003. And that's really recent history. It's not that's really close to us. And then following that, there was a survey done in 2018, and it suggested that around a quarter of British people did not think that non-consensual sex in a marriage constituted rape. That's in 2018, and it's horrifying to me. And then you get the victim blaming culture as well. I mean, we've seen multiple like horrifying cases. We've seen, you know, the idea that we always have to put the blame on the woman for violence committed against her. What was she wearing? How did she antagonize him? And you see this all the time. It is not uncommon, and it's so profoundly disturbing to me that we as a society as a whole are still so we're just not dealing with this issue. We're not looking it in the face, and we're not putting the onus on men not to do it. We're putting the onus on women to not be hurt, which is as opposed to the perpetrator. We're blaming the victim rather than the perpetrator. And, you know, obviously we're starting to become more aware of this with things like the Me Too movement. And there are, we are starting to look at it, but it's so disturbing to me that it's happening so slowly. And again, why would you not support stopping this? But there's so many reasons why I find it so disturbing on like a personal and a general level.
What do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I think, well, part of, as authors, I think that we can keep writing about women, essentially, keep telling women's stories, and not just telling stories about domestic violence and trying to shine a light on that, but just keep showing women everywhere and doing everything. Female representation is just such an important part of this, and not basically just focusing on women, writing complex, compelling female characters. It's not exactly that I'm suggesting that books can create sympathy for women, because I think if you're a misogynist, I don't know how much a book is going to help you with that. It can't. It's difficult to know how much impact you're having. But for me, it's just, as with anything, women should be everywhere. We should be in every industry. We should be leading. We should be writing. We should be creating. We should be. There's an old saying, I can't remember who said it, but the basic saying is, I cannot be what I cannot see. And I think that authors can help create characters who are mirrors for other girls and women to find certain kinds of strength within themselves, and to see themselves doing great things, going on adventures, having agency. And it's part of a much larger system. And I think it's going to take a really long time. I think it is, like I say, it's happening too slowly, but I hope that, in my own small way, I can affect change by writing books about women, and books about women who are humanized and who are portrayed as being fully human beings, who aren't just flat stereotypes, and who aren't consistently having violence committed against them, even in fiction. Because the other thing is, if we keep showing worlds where women have violence committed against them, and if that is the standard, even in fantasy fiction is supposed to show that there can be other ways. So for me, I want to show that, I want to show worlds where women do not fear this sort of gender-based violence. And that's my way of doing it. It's just trying to imagine a world beyond patriarchy. So I think that imagination is part of it as well, showing that maybe one day we can move past this.
Thanks so much for answering all our questions, Samantha. It was an amazing session. We had excellent discussions from the audience, and especially from you. And once again, thanks for answering our questions, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to go through some of the goodie bundles again, and Samantha can let you guys see what awesome things are available. So Samantha has generously donated 3 awesome goodie bundles to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page, including goodie bundle number 1, the Bone Season bundle, with 1 UK edition paperback set, white version of the Bone Season trilogy, including the Bone Season, the Mime Order, and the Song Rising, signed and personalized, and a set of Bone Season themed temporary tattoos. Goodie bundle number 2 is the Song Rising bundle, a rare hardcover edition. 1 copy of the white hardcover UK edition of the Song Rising with sprayed edges. This edition is now a rarity and is much sought after by book collectors. And a set of Bone Season themed temporary tattoos. The goodie bundle number 3 is the Mime Order bundle, and there is 1 first edition red hardcover of the Mime Order. You may choose between the US or UK editions, and 1 set of Bone Season themed temporary tattoos. So there's only 1 each of these bundles, and they are only available for donors in the UK and US. So if you live in either of these countries and would love to get your mitts on one of these exclusive treats, donate now to snag one before someone else does. There are also plenty other author goodies available from authors including Kat Cho, Sebastian de Castel, Alex Segura, Meg Gardiner, Sarah Gailey, and more. We've raised $2,230 towards our $5,000 goal so far, which is fairly slow. So please give generously before the fundraiser ends on the 18th of October. And because all funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. I'm going to share a slide in a minute with some information about how and where you can donate. Ta-da! There you go. So if you can donate to get these goodies on Rally Up at R4P Rally Up 2020. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixels, go to bit.ly Read for Pixels. So we're back. And to find out more about violence against women, you can visit our website at thepixelproject.net. So Samantha, do you have anything that you'd like to announce before we go off?
Yes, my next project is The Mask Falling. It is book 4 in the Bone Season series. It will be coming out on the 16th of February 2021. I'm really, really excited about it. This is my favorite book in the series so far. I promise you many more complex, interesting women, and a continuation of Paige's journey. Like I said, I'm very excited about it. So I really hope that you'll pick it up when it comes out.
Okay, thank you so much once again, Samantha, and thank you everyone who participated, wherever you are in the world. Good night, good evening, and good morning.
Bye.
Bye.